Welcome to the Money Metaphors podcast with your host, Jason Coddington. Jason, this is probably a necessary podcast today. You've titled it Rules of the Road. So I'm looking forward to what those rules might be. How are you?
Good, good. Yeah. Well, if we have rules, right, in our society, everywhere you go, we have them. You have them. You have bylaws. You have, speed, speed rules, of course,
Not
speed
that they're followed
limits
in New
and
Jersey, okay, but
right,
there are speed limits.
right. And of course, right, we know, uh, what did we learn about reading Lord of the Flies? The paradox of that book is that, in the absence of rules, there are typically less freedom.
Yep.
So we'll talk a little bit about some rules today as it relates to financial freedom. Um, and again, there's so many different concepts out there, but if you can remember some of these, I think you're going to be good. And I think they address some younger individuals, but there's a couple in there that I think will also help for those that are in retirement or nearing retirement. So just some things to consider. And I like the rules, if you will, or the synopsis, because if we can attach them, hope, like with me, they've been lifelong, or not lifelong, but most of my professional career, we've used these
Mhm.
week in and week out.
Yeah.
So it's nice to, and they just kind of stick there, and I think people remember it. So we'll talk about that.
So are
And
these like written rules, the understood rules, the unwritten rules? What's the deal?
well, so there's written rules, right? So and most of these are, we'll call them unwritten, because there's no
Okay.
guarantees in finance, right? So it's not
Right.
like if you do X, you're going to get Y, because of course markets are volatile. Um, and we all know that from the last, 25 years. Things happen, COVID happens, banks fail. So
Unfortunately, yeah.
right, so things happen, wars start, and if you look over the history of the stock market or equities or even the bond market, different times, different things. No one ever just has a crystal ball and gets it right. If they get it
Yeah.
right, they're lucky. And if they get it right twice, they're extra lucky. And so again, these are more unwritten, but I think they're good. They're good guideposts, benchmarks, if you will. So there are plenty of written rules out there, like we talked about. The speed limits one, taxes, got to pay your taxes on time. There's some consequences if you don't.
Yeah.
Um, and I would say unwritten rules also have consequences if you don't do them, right? I mean, or they could potentially have consequences. So
Mhm.
we'll talk a little bit about that. Baseball has some, unwritten rules, right? If you ever watched a baseball game, if you're a pitcher in a baseball, if you bean one of their players, likely one of their pitchers is going to turn around and bean one of you.
It's
So
very likely. Yeah.
very likely. Wine tasting, there's plenty of, I know that, but there's just some, again, you can fill my cup to wherever you want, so it doesn't bother me. But if you are a waiter, if you're serving your host, you don't want to fill anybody's glass higher than the others. You want to keep them level, so that
Oh,
those are
yeah.
some unwritten rules, things like that. Using the backpacking analogy, we backpack in the Sierra Nevadas. We really don't like to cross mountain passes in the middle of the afternoon. We like to do that by at least 1 o'clock. And the reason for that is it could be perfectly great weather on the valley floor in the middle of July. But if you get in the mountains, Sierra Nevadas, you can have rain, you can have thunder, you have lightning. So again, not a hard and fast rule. There's nothing chiseled in stone that says you can't do that. But if you want to avoid the elements, it might make sense to do that. So
Okay.
those are just some examples, of some unwritten rules. And then uh, we'll kind of delve into some financial considerations as well, where there's some unwritten and written. Finance, of course, is an area where there's just tons of rules, right? I
Yeah.
think most, if you were to look back at previous podcasts, we've talked about some of those tax rules. And really that's, and some other, and rules with holding an investment, surrender charges, those kinds of things. So, there's pre-tax, post-tax, there's lots of ages, age 59 and a half. If you have IRAs, age 74, age 73, Social Security, when can you take it? Take it at 62. Do you take it at 66, 67? Is there full retirement? Less, And of course, if you take money from your IRA prior to 15 and a half, you could have early penalties, or withdrawals.
Oh, yeah.
Or if you have a CD for that matter, you could have withdrawal rules everywhere. But again, we're there to help protect and provide individuals with, some guidance. And that's what rules are, right? That's what,
Yeah.
should follow. So we'll explore some today. It's fun for me to do this. Again, anecdotally, it's nice because we can, use some examples. Some of you might have heard of them, but we'll revisit them, and hopefully they stick with you. And if you know someone that should hear it, share it with them, and hopefully it will empower them in their financial future. So,
Yeah, very good. All right. So let's get started. Where do we want to start?
well, the one that's my favorite, because I think it sets the precedent for all, is this one called the Rule of 72. So now I was born in 1972, so maybe that's why I remember it. But basically, the Rule of 72 is an example of it exemplifies compound interest, right? So compound interest, Albert Einstein, had mentioned it's, like the eighth wonder of the world. And how the Rule 72 comes into play is if you divide your rate of return into 72, that tells you how long it takes for your money to double. So that being said, if you're earning 10% in the stock market on average over the last 10 years, let's say, if you divide that out, every 7 years, your money will double. So a $10,000 investment, assuming a 10% rate of return, would be worth $20,000 in 7 years if it earned 10%. So, and the converse is true. If it earned 7%, it would be worth double in 10 years.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's a nice rule. It's pretty simple. And you can also finagle the ratio to figure out, okay, if I want to, what kind of rate of return do I want to have if I want to double my money in a specific amount of time? So another way to work the ratio. But the way we use it, quite frankly, is a real quick scenario, especially when we're teaching this to teens, and to explain the difference in compound, interest. Is the number one benefit of compound interest is time, right?
Yeah.
So if you have, let's say, 40 years to save, for retirement, let's say you're, in your 20s, the more time that your money can double, whether it's at 7% or 10%, the more you're going to have. And so it's nice to just kind of have individuals walk through that, so if you're earning, using that 7% scenario, or we'll use 7% rate of return scenario. If you've got 40 years, every 10 years, your money is going to double. So 10,000 of your 20. So 10,000 turns into 20,000 when you're 30. It turns into 40,000, when you're 40. It turns into 80,000 when you're 50. And then it turns into 160,000 when you're 60. I mean, again, these are assuming rates of return, but that's the rule
Yeah.
of 72. So,
Good rule.
yeah, we like that a lot. And that's compounding. And that is how you accumulate wealth. And, over the long term, it's been proven that way. Again, markets go up and down, but, it's kind of a good guidepost. So it reinforces the ability, power of compound interest, and the importance of starting early if you can. So we like that.
Great. Well,
So
this next rule seems pretty obvious to me, but I don't think a lot of people necessarily abide by it.
yeah, I think, and it's harder now with inflation at higher rates. I mean, things
Yeah.
cost more. So, and we're going to kind of put 3 rules together.
Okay.
But the first, these 3 that'll just kind of, we'll button them up because I think they go hand in hand. So spend less than you make. It's
Yeah.
like, well, that just goes without saying. How in the world could I spend more than I make? Well, believe you me, people do it. I mean, I believe, and we can have the data in the show notes that will support this information. But credit card debt, is at an all-time high. Consumer debt is at an all-time high. And that was
Yeah,
after
the
being
irony and the irony was, Jason, the consumer debt had started to come down during COVID.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, cash was king, and people were buckled up. But I think a lot of what's, again, currently this environment we're in, what's propping up the current spending is debt. And
Yeah,
so that happens when you're spending spending more than you make. And so it really sounds like um you know, it really is simple. I think it's hard to implement. So we'll talk about a couple things um, next, some other rules, unwritten rules that you should use to help you spend, um, less than you make, so you can have something. So
yeah,
one of those rules is pay yourself first. So, and what in the world do I mean by that? Pay
yeah.
yourself first, because it seems it goes without saying. Well, of course I'm going to pay myself first. I'm going to work. I'm going to get a paycheck. What we're typically saying there is, or what I'm saying there, and I think most advisors would agree, is paying yourself first means that when you earn your income, you take a chunk of that, portion of that, if you will, and you save it somewhere, long term, short term, whatever your goals might be. And
Okay,
you
okay.
do that first, right? And organizational behavior, there was a individual, or there's a excuse me, not an individual, but well, there was an individual that came up with it. I don't know his first name, but his last name was Parkinson. And so there's this thing called Parkinson's corollary. And what that means is the job will take the hours allotted for it. So if a 4 hour
Mm,
job is allotted 8 hours, someone's going to take 8 hours for it. Well, that's the same in finance, right? So if it's a 4 hour job, um, but you've allotted 8 hours to complete it, it's going to take 8 hours to complete it. So the logic
yeah,
there is don't allot the 8 hours. In finance, it's the same way. If at the end of the month, the money exists, so you're just going to spend it, right? So the way to reverse engineer that is to pay yourself first, and ideally is to do that through uh, automatic contributions.
gotcha.
Most
Yeah.
employers now, at least in California, you have to have a retirement plan of some sort. If you don't have one, the state has one for you. Um, is take a portion of your income and save it for your future. Um, and the way we like to think of it is whatever you might make the first hour of your day, that's your hour. That hour's for you. So
Yeah.
each day. So, and the nice thing about it is if you have a 401k or a retirement plan of some sort, that money goes in pre-tax. And so pay yourself first, as opposed to, you know what, I'm going to save for my trip to Cancun, hypothetically speaking, and you're going to go through the month and then it comes down to, oh, there's nothing there to save. So you got to pay yourself first. And if possible, automate it. We'll have some resources here in
Mhm.
the show notes for you, but that pay yourself first helps you spend less than you make, because if it's not in the account to spend, it's not there. So we like that.
You've removed it from the equation, essentially.
Right. It's not there it's not there to be used. And I mean, I'm guilty, I do this for a living. I'm guilty of it. So I mean,
We all
it's
do. We're not.
that's right.
None of
Yeah.
us are righteous here.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Golf club shows up that you might like. I don't know.
Yeah.
None of them help me because I still hit it crooked no matter what the technology is. So
Yeah, I'm really good going to the right, man. I'm a pro. I should probably just
yeah.
shift my stance entirely and just let it go.
Yeah, yeah. So and so I think, that leads me to the next rule, which is 10%. So save 10% of your income. So, and I think, and if you can get to that, early, that's another good rule. So does it mean it's going to guarantee? But if you think about it from this perspective, especially if you're younger, um, just getting started, 20s, 30s, 10% of your income paid first, and an account that grows tax deferred for your future, um, is really important. And I'll say just here, I don't know if my daughter is going to ever listen to these podcasts or not, but my oldest daughter is a teacher.
Yeah.
And when she had just got her job, we sat down and I said, you're not going to micromanage what you do, but here's one thing that I think is really important, is to save 10% of what you make. And so, in working with her, That's the guidance I gave, my own kid,
Yeah.
and, I don't check on her every month and see if she's doing that, but you get the point. I mean, I think that was the advice I give my own kid, is just the first dollar, 10% goes away and you just will never miss it. If you can do that the rest of your life, you're going to be in good shape statistically.
Yeah.
I think COVID, and that leads me to the next kind of piece. So save 10% of your income. We think that's very important. I think during COVID, we learned some things. There were some statistics out there. Again, we'll have the resources in the notes, but I think the average family didn't have at least 1 month's worth of living expenses for emergencies, or to replace their wages if they lost their job. I mean, it was like 56%, if I remember that number. And that's astonishing to me. And so the other
Well,
rule of the road.
Jason, you know this, we do live on the edge. We live
Yeah.
right on the most Americans, most people probably, I should just say it like that, do live pretty close to not paycheck to paycheck, but maybe real close to that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and so we just saw that. It's astonishing. And that again leads to why the whole debt situation, right? So,
Yeah.
and people, I think, were able to save because they weren't able to go do entertainment. They weren't able to go out and eat because everything was shut
True.
down.
What were you going to do? Right.
Right. So it's kind of, I would rather have not gone through that experience, but I mean, at least those positive things came out of it. One positive thing is everybody now knows how to use a QR code.
Yeah.
So, prior to COVID, you went to a menu, you just got handed a menu. Now,
Yeah.
you're
You're
like, you
like,
have to
oh,
ask for one. But as we digress, I'll get back on track. But, we think this leads to the next is we really believe, as a general rule, and we're so passionate about it. And I think I've said this in earlier podcasts, is you really want to have 3 months worth of living expenses in a safe, liquid place. If you can get there, I mean,
yeah.
get to 1 month, then over time, get to 2. Of course, if your retirement plan offers matching funds, so, and like we'll use someone's example with, if you work for an employer and you're saving 10% of your income, they might match, dollar for dollar the first 3%. So you got to do that. So, cause how in the world do you not give up, a match? But outside of that, we would want clients really to have, especially young couples, to have that 3 to 6 months of cash reserve built for their future. Um, and, life's going to throw you curveballs, tires going to go flat, washer and dryer are going to break. Dogs are going to, in my case, eat a sock and have emergency surgery, that kind of stuff,
Oh, yeah.
so you got to have those resources to pay for those unforeseen and the best way I think I can explain this visually is, we'll talk about that long-term money, your 401k or your retirement
Yeah.
money. Think of that as a castle for your future. And if we go back to, kind of medieval times, most castles had a moat around them, right? And to protect them, from
Yes.
invasion. And your cash reserve is that moat that protects your retirement account. Because if there's no moat, if there's no buffer, then okay, well, if you're not going to go into debt, then what do you have to go do? You have to go sacrifice your long-term assets to pay for those emergency expenses. And now that money that we talked about, rule of 72, that was supposed to compound over time, is taken out and no longer left to
Yeah.
compound. So we really, I think the anchor, the premise is 10% of your income. And if you do that, with the exception of meeting your employer's match, do that until you have 3 months worth of living expenses. And if you can do that early and young, you will set your foundation up for your financial future amazingly. So,
Well, it's interesting too, because you're talking, I'm sitting here thinking about how much, um, I don't want to get, I'm shying away from the word easier, but I'm going to use it. It is now, because now banks offer services where you can not only contribute with you at your employer to a 401k or to a private retirement plan, you can have the bank automatically take money and move it to another account.
yeah,
You can basically set up a payment to a savings account so that you don't actually have to remember to do it, you can automate some of these processes now, which I would think, you know, would be make it so much easier. When I was much younger, it was difficult to be like, okay, I got to take this money and set it aside. It was much easier for my employer to take money out and put it in a 401k. And I
Yeah,
didn't have to
yeah,
do it myself,
absolutely.
you know?
Yeah. Right. And there's a we'll call it the piggy bank factor with that 401k
Yeah.
money, because you know what, you got to go get it from the shelf, right? And
Yep.
some people are probably like, what's a piggy bank? But anyway, the point is, you got this, this bank, this in your, we used to put coins as a kid, and if you wanted to go get it, you had to go through the painstaking process of either breaking the bank if it didn't have a little uh, hole in the bottom of it, or you have to rip that hole open, which was a
Yeah.
little bit difficult. And then just that psychology of doing that just was enough. And so I think having that money where they can't get it you can't, you kind of protect yourself that way.
Yeah.
So we like that. Um, and so those are just some guidelines. So we like the 10% rule, rule of 72 compounding. Most of these are all these rules or these guidelines or benchmarks. There's plenty in our industry, but I think if you know these, you're going to be in a good, we'll give you a unique way to remember it at the end of the show. But I think, these are all ways to accumulate money. Now we're going to switch it a little bit, and talk about when you start to take money out or you need money. So, and this is something that's been debated, but I think it's a good guideline. And so, each individual's financial situation is different. So again, we want to work through that with your advisor. If you come to us, we're going to be very, tailor-made, but it is a good benchmark. And so it's called a 4% distribution or 4% withdrawal rate.
Okay.
And so if you have a portfolio, when you're retired, and we'll make it relatively easy. Let's say, and this is just the assets. This is not income, right? So if you have income from a pension or Social Security or other places, maybe you have part-time income or farm income or rental income, it's separate. This is just on your invested assets, your portfolio. So we'll hypothetically say you have $1 million of invested assets. And statistically speaking, if you were to keep your distribution rate at 4% of that $1 million over time, the odds of you having some money when you're passing away, most scenarios use age 90 or 95, there's a high probability, irrespective of your asset allocation, whether you're 30% stock, 70% bond, or 70% stock, 30% bond. Did I say that twice the same way? Let me back up.
No, you think you got it right.
Yeah.
70%
Anyway,
stock, 30% bond, or 70% bond, 30% stock.
either part of the spectrum,
Yeah.
a 4% distribution rate works, right? So, and the reason this is helpful is like, if you and I could both go have a blood test, and your cholesterol is going to be something and my cholesterol is going to be something, and there's a
Yeah.
bunch of other factors that go into that. What's your cholesterol, what's your cholesterol, what's your good cholesterol, what's your bad cholesterol, those kinds of things, what's your blood pressure, they can look at all of that. Well, but at a good, doctors have some guidelines that, cholesterol under 200 is probably decent, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is that 4% rule from us. So if someone comes in our office and says, hey, I've got this money, I'm going to retire, do you think I'm going to be okay? This is a relatively quick rule of thumb way to say, hey, they're going to probably be okay, or they're going to be in shape. Now, if their distribution rate is like, let's say 7% or 8%, so they're taking out 80,000 on that million a year
Yeah.
when they start. And assuming, of course, if they're in their 60s, because the older you get, the more you can take out and increase the
Sure.
probability. But my word, I mean, it doesn't matter. The paradox is most people want to be conservative when they're retired. And if they take out more money, they have to be more aggressive. So it's really unique. So we like to have, so the way that, this is kind of how we'll bundle this up. So that 4% rule is really important. So if you're getting to retirement and you're thinking, okay, I have all my other income, what could I take from my portfolio?
Yeah.
4% is a relatively good number. It's also, and there's no there's no correlation here, but it's also unique to me that most endowments in the United States have a 5% distribution policy. They don't exceed that. So Stanford is the ones that's most famous, because they've got a couple Nobel laureates on there, Bill Sharp, running their endowment. And then, when times were really good, the go-go, 1990 to 2000, 1995 to 2000, and of course, leading up to the financial crisis, there was a lot of push from, alumni to take more, hey, we could help more kids. And the result
Yeah.
was, look, we're not going above 5%. And that proved very beneficial to them. So now again, endowments have money coming in. When you're retired, you're not putting as much in, of course. So it changes the game a little bit, but 5 and 4% are relatively tested numbers. And again, you want your individual number as a client or potential client is your own, but it's a good benchmark to look at. So we like that. So that being said, we'll kind of end it. If to sum it, really it comes down to two things, and it's 10-4. And for those of you that, so those of you that come, or were around in the late 70s, you probably, there was a trucking craze. There was songs about, trucking and CBs and a CB handle. So, but one of the most famous, trucking movies, Smokey and the Bandit, right? So Burt Reynolds,
Yeah.
Sally Field, Jerry Reed, of course, and 10-4, good buddy. So if you can remember
10-4, good buddy.
10-4, good buddy, 10% savings in your for your future, and 4% when you start withdrawal. No guarantees, but statistically speaking, you'll be better than most Americans and put you on the road to success. So keep on trucking, I guess, is what we'll say with your financial future.
You're giving me flashbacks. You're giving me flashbacks here. Well, people want to get a hold of you and they don't have a CB radio. How can they reach out to you, Jason?
Yeah, my handle. I don't know what my handle would be, but
What would your
anyway,
handle be?
559-897-0040 to call us. And or if you'd like to schedule an appointment on our website, there's a link in the top right-hand corner where you can do that. Book a 15-minute appointment or an in-person meeting, or we can even do it through Zoom as well, and we can talk these concepts through. And I would say, go with that. But I also would say, if you know of a young person that hasn't heard these concepts, share this podcast with them. Hopefully it's not too boring for them, but if they can just remember a couple of the rules, the 10% and pay yourself first, they'll be well on their way to a good financial future. So.
And that is a 10-4, good buddy. Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. For those of you who are listening to this podcast and are not a subscriber, I would urge you to become one. Hit the subscribe button. That way you won't miss one of these podcasts. Since Jason puts one out, you'll be notified. As Jason suggested, if you find this interesting or useful and you know somebody that might benefit from listening to it, tell them about it. Give it to them. Let's spread the word about the podcast. And it might, in fact, benefit them. Jason says if it's not too boring, this is actually essential good stuff. And I think he does a good job not being boring, a lot of this material. On behalf of Jason and everybody at Coddington Wealth, I'm Bill Tucker, urging you now to go out and have a great day or not. It's your choice. Thanks for listening.